Today, we're going to make this cool radial progress dial. Let's go. In last week's video, we created this circle segments node. Today, we're going to use this node plus several others that we've created previously to create a circle progress dial. While we're working on this, if I mention a node that you don't recognize, chances are it's one that we've created previously in the series. Down in the description, I've added links to where to find all of the nodes that we've created so far. So just take a look down there and you'll find the video where I describe how to make each one of those nodes. All right, let's get started making this progress dial. So the first thing that we need to do is to come into our shaders folder here. Oh, and by the way, we're starting out in Unity today, but in just a minute, we'll finish up in Unity and switch over to Unreal. So you can jump ahead if you want to know how to make this in Unreal. I'm going to right click in here and pick Create Shader Graph Subgraph. And we're going to call this Progress Dial. And I'll open it up. So the first thing that we need to do is bring in some UV coordinates. So I'm going to create myself a vector2 parameter in the blackboard. And I'll select that and open up my graph inspector here. And we're going to set this use custom binding label and we'll set it to UV0. So I'm going to bring in my UV coordinate parameter and we'll add a branch on input connection and connect it up to both the input and connected. And now I'm going to add my UV coordinates. And what this is going to do is allow this subgraph to use these UVs as the default for this input parameter. Okay, so we've got our UV coordinates now. The next thing that we need is to create polar coordinates because UV coordinates are in a square grid. And what we actually want is a circle. So we're going to add our polar coordinates node and plug our UVs into that. So what you can see here is now instead of UVs that are vertical and horizontal, we've got UVs that are going around in a circle. Okay, so the next thing that we need is to correct the gradient here. This gradient going around in a circle is from negative 0.5 to 0.5. And what we actually want is one that goes from 0 to 1. And so I'm going to add a split node here to separate out our coordinates. And then we're going to create an add node and just add 0.5. And now you can see we've got a nice gradient that goes from 0 around the circle to 1. Okay, so we're making some good progress. The next thing that we need to do is divide this gradient up into segments. And in order to do that, I'm going to add a posterize node. And what this node does, it's really easy to see. It takes a gradient like this and splits it up into segments. And you can see segments here is called steps. And I actually want 18 steps, so I'm just going to type 18. And now you can see that this nice smooth range going around our circle is actually split up into 18 individual steps. And I want to add a parameter in our blackboard over here to control how many steps there are. So I'm just going to add a float here, and we're going to call this segments. And I'm going to default, or actually, I'm going to call this steps. I'm going to default this to 18. So we'll have 18 individual steps or segments to our progress bar. And I can just plug our steps right into the posterize node there to break up our radial gradient into our 18 steps. Okay, the next thing that we need is a way to take this gradient, now that we've gone from a smooth gradient to a stepped gradient, we need a way to be able to step through each of the individual shades on this gradient. In Substance Designer, the node that we need is called HistogramScan. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to create a HistogramScan node together. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll jump out of our progress dial graph here. And I'm going to come down here to my procedural library. We'll come into helpers. And I'm going to right click and pick Create shader graph subgraph. And we're going to call this HistogramScan. And we'll open it up and make this node now. So in order to make HistogramScan, what we need is an input gradient. So I'll add a float and call it gradient. And we need an input that defines the position along that gradient. So I'm going to add another new float and call it position. And finally, we need a control for the contrast, or how sharp our resulting gradient's going to be. So I'm going to add a new float and call it contrast. And now let's add some defaults to these. So for position, I'm just going to default this to 0.5. For gradient, we're going to add a default gradient. So I'm going to check use custom binding, and we're just going to add the linear gradient as our default. We'll do that in a minute. And then for contrast, we're going to default this to 0.9 to make a gradient. The default gradient is going to be fairly sharp, but not perfectly sharp. All right, so let's bring in our gradient node here, or our gradient parameter, and we'll add a branch on input connection node and connect it up. And for our default gradient, we're just going to add, like I said, we're just going to add our linear gradient, which is a node that we've created previously. And just for fun, we'll plug in the V coordinate so our gradient is vertical. All right, so we've got our gradient coming in here. The next thing that we need to do is bring in our position. And for our position, we're going to take this value. Oh, I actually spelled it wrong. Let's just fix that really quick. We're going to take this value and multiply it by 2 and subtract 1 to expand its range to -1 to 1. So I'll multiply by 2 and subtract 1. And this is the position node here is normally in a range of 0 to 1, but by multiplying by 2 and subtracting 1, we're putting it in a range of -1 to 1, which is going to allow us to scan through the gradient. So the next thing that I'm going to do is add our position to our gradient, and this is the value that we're going to use to be able to scan back and forth through the gradient to get the results that we're looking for. Okay, next we need to work on our contrast. So I'll bring in our contrast parameter, and I'm going to invert the contrast by adding a 1- node. And now we'll bring in our position up here, and we're going to subtract the contrast from the position and then saturate that value. And now we're going to add the position to the contrast and also saturate that value. And then we're going to take these two values that we've calculated, and the final step that we need to do here is add a smooth step node. And we're going to use this as edge 1. We're going to use this as edge 2. And then we're going to use this as our input. And this is going to give us our final result. So let me just add some sliders here really quickly so I can show you what these different parameters do. So here's a slider that's going to be our position. And you can see as I slide this position, we're able to scan through our gradient. So our gradient starts out like this, our linear gradient. So our gradient starts out like this, our linear gradient. And we're able to slide through that gradient using our position input. And if we set position to 0.5, just so it's in the middle there, I want to show you what we can do with our contrast. So let's add a slider for that one. So with no contrast, we have the full range of values here. But as I slide this slider, what you're going to see is that our gradient gets sharper and sharper here in toward the middle. So we've got 0 contrast and a contrast value of 1. So that's kind of like the range of our gradient. And then this one is the position of our gradient along the 0 to 1 range. All right, so that is our HistogramScan node, and we're ready to use it. Let's go ahead and make an output here. And for our output, we just want to call it out. And we're going to set it to float. And now we can just plug it in, and we're all done with our HistogramScan node. One thing that I forgot, we need to come over here to our subgraphs, And for the path, we need to set this to procedural/helpers. And we also need to set our graph settings to preview 2D. Okay, so now we can come back into our progress dial that we're making. And I can just type HistogramScan. And there's the node that we just created. So I can plug our posterize into the gradient. And I'm going to set our contrast to 1. And now we need a parameter that controls the progress. So we'll come over here and add a float parameter, and we're going to call this progress. And let's just default progress to 0.5. And I'll bring that parameter in, and we're going to plug that into our position. So now I can take this progress, actually just for now, let's use a slider so I can show you what this does. And I'm going to plug slider into position there. And now you can see I can scan along our gradient. I can go from 0 around to 1. But one thing that you'll notice is that I can't actually make it all the way to the other side. There's this spot here where there's some empty space. I'm not able to go all the way from 0 to 1. And so what I can do to fix that is just add a multiply node. And we're going to multiply this by 1.004, something like that. And that'll just give us a tiny bit more range. So now we can go from empty all the way around the circle to full. And the nice thing about this is that I can control the number of steps here. So if I just want like 5 steps, for example, oh, that's a cool looking gradient. Now with my progress bar, I can get a little bit more granular, or I can set the steps to something really high, like 50. And now I can go around kind of with more steps. So pretty cool. We're making some great progress. Let's keep going. I think the next thing that we want to do is introduce a circle. So let's go ahead and come up to this top part of our graph, and we're going to add in the circle node that we've created previously. This is going to allow us to make a mask to mask out our radial dial here. So let's set our circle size to 0.9. And instead of the fill, which is what we're seeing here, let's use the SDF, and we'll drag out here and create an anti-aliasing node that is going to resolve our SDF gradient. So I'm going to set the cutoff to 0, and then we'll add a 1- here to invert it so that we get a nice circle gradient there. All right, and I'm just going to minimize these. Actually, just really quickly, I'm going to plug in my UV coordinates here just so I don't forget that. I'm going to kind of pack these in a little bit better. And now what we have here is a mask that we can use to multiply by the result of our histogram scan. So I'm just going to create a multiply node, and we'll plug it into our histogram scan. And now when we use our progress slider here, you can see that we're getting a really nice looking kind of pie-shaped pattern, and we can scan through that pie shape and get a nice looking progress bar. So if all you wanted to do was create a kind of a pie-shaped progress bar, this is it. You're done. Great job. This is looking cool, and you can see that we can change the size of the pie with our input value. However, we're making a progress dial, and there are a couple of more steps that we want to add to this. Let's go ahead and use the node that we created last week. This is our circle segments node, and we'll bring this in. And by default, our circle segments node is animated because we're passing linear time into rotation. And just so that we don't create any seizures here from this crazy looking motion. By the way, I apologize for that last week. Let's go ahead and just add a float 0 value here so we can fix our pattern in place. And for the spacing on this, we're going to add a value of 0.1. And so this is going to end up being our mask for the segments around our dial. Here we've got a segments input, and we can go ahead and connect up the number of steps to our segments input. Steps defaults to 18, and we had it set to 18 before, and so it didn't change anything. But what you can see now is we've got this mask with these lines that we can use to multiply with our circular pattern. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to take the result that we've got here, and we're going to add a multiply. And I'll multiply that by the wedges output of our circle segments. And now you can see that our pattern here is divided up into individual wedge shapes. So if we bring our slider over and kind of slide through, you can see that our progress is advancing and it's divided up into wedge shapes. However, you might have noticed that the division of the wedges here is not lined up with the divisions of our kind of advancing progress. So one wedge has the split of the mask right down the middle. And that's not what we want. We want to change these kind of these radial spikes so that they line up with our wedges, and so that we can get a nice looking progress with solid wedges instead of wedges that are split down the middle. So in order to do that, we need to take our number of steps and find the reciprocal of our number of steps. And in Unity, that's easy. I can just use the reciprocal node. And basically what this is doing is it's doing 1 divided by this value. So in our case, our steps value is 18. And we're doing 1 over 18 to get this value here. And that's going to give us the amount of rotation that we need to turn this dial so that we can line up our wedge divisions with our pie shapes here. And we also only want to rotate by half of a wedge. And so I'm going to take this reciprocal value and multiply it by 0.5 to get half of a turn. So what we're doing here basically is we're finding how much do we need to turn this thing so that we go 1 wedge shape, and then with this multiply by 0.5, we're turning it half a wedge shape. So now I can just plug this multiply here into rotation, and now you can see that our wedge divisions here are right on the borders between our shapes. So when I turn my slider, you can see that our shapes fill in one at a time with the wedges mask lining up perfectly with the spacing that we've got here. All right, so we're almost there. There's just a couple more features that we need to add. First thing, right now we've got this shape that looks like a pie, and we actually want a shape that looks like kind of a circular outline. And what that means is we need to add another circular mask. So this circle mask here is the outline for our outside, and we need to create another circular mask that is the outline for our inside. Before we do that though, I'm going to clean up my graph. I've got quite a few previews open here, and there's just a lot going on. So I'm going to kind of minimize some of these nodes and pack them together so we have a little bit prettier graph layout. All right, that's a little bit nicer. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to copy this circle mask up here, and we're going to paste it down here at the bottom. And instead of a size of 0.9, I'm going to give this circle mask a size of 0.65. And now we have, you know, a big outer circle and a smaller inner circle. And right now I have this 1 minus node, but I actually don't want that. I want it to look like this. So I can delete the 1 minus. And now I can just take this and multiply it in with the result that we've got so far. And now you can see I've got this really cool circular dial going on. I've got that outer circle mask and the inner circle mask, and we're using our circle segments node to divide up our dial into these individual progress pips. Okay, the last thing that we need to do is add some color. Right now we've got our alpha channel, and I can go ahead and add that here. I'm just going to call this alpha, and then set this to a float, and connect this right up. So that's going to give us the alpha channel for our dial. And I can take the mask that we've created and blend between a couple of colors. Let's come up here to our progress dial, to our blackboard. And we're going to add a color for start color and another color for our end color. And let's go ahead and set some default values. For start color, I want to add a value that's kind of a purple and maybe not completely saturated, maybe just kind of a slightly darker purple color. And then for our end color, we're going to set our end color to something that's kind of an orangey yellow. All right, so let's bring in our start color and our end color parameters. And we're going to lerp between these two parameters. So I'm going to plug my end color into the lerp A and my start color into the lerp B. And then we're going to come over here to our gradient where we've posterized it into segments and use this as our blend value for the lerp. And so now you can see what we're getting is this nice gradient that goes from purple all the way around to yellow. So if I just take this gradient here and multiply it by my mask, cool. Now you can see I'm getting my nice progress bar and it's colorized. So let's grab our slider here and bring it over and just make sure that we're getting the results that we're looking for. So we're starting out purple, and as we go around the circle, we get to a value of that nice yellow. Now this is not as dark as I wanted, so let's go ahead and set our start color here to a little bit darker value of purple, maybe kind of halfway down here like that. All right, cool. So there is our parameter, or our progress dial. Now, one thing that I'm noticing is that the yellow kind of comes in here pretty quick. We don't stay purple for very long. And I want to adjust that a little bit. I want there to be more purple going around this dial. And the way that I'm going to adjust that is I'm going to bring the output of my posterized node over here and just add a power node so that I can adjust the output curve. And I'm going to set this to a power of 0.6. So now when I plug my mask in, you can see that that gives me just a little bit more purple coming around this circle. And obviously you can tune this to however you'd like it to be. The higher this value goes, the more yellow you're going to be getting. But as soon as you go below 1, the lower this value goes, the more purple you're going to be getting. So you can tune this power value here to control the balance between your start color and your end color. All right, so we've had a slider here up until now, and I'm going to bring this slider over here, and instead of using that slider, I'm going to plug in our progress value so that we can control that value from outside the subgraph. And now we just need to add in our output here. So we're going to create a new output called color, and I'll set this to be a vector 3, and we'll plug in our colorized version of the progress dial. And we're all done. Just a couple of finishing touches. We're going to set this to procedural /samples. And we'll come over and set our preview to be 2D. But yeah, now we have a really nice progress dial, and you can use this progress input value here on the subgraph to control how far around the circle we are. You know, if this is a loading screen or some kind of a cooldown indicator, you can control that with this progress input on the subgraph. All right, cool. Thanks for watching. Let's go ahead and switch over to Unreal and make this same UI element there as well. All right, here we are in Unreal, and this is the circle segments material function that we created last week. Today we're going to use this circle segments node along with several others to create our progress dial. So let's go ahead and get started on that. We'll open up our content drawer here, come over here to our shaders folder, and I'm going to right click and create a material function, and we're going to call this progress dial. And we'll open it up and get started. Let's go ahead and set our preview to a plane here. We'll set this to 50-degree field of view, just setting up some of my preferences. All right, so the first thing that we need to do in our graph here is bring in some polar coordinates. So I'll add a polar coordinates node. And we need to bring in our UV coordinates for that as well. So I'm going to create a function input, and this is going to be a vector 2, and we'll call this UV. And I need to check this use preview value as default. And then we're going to add texture coordinates to this so that it'll use these texture coordinates by default if our input is not connected to anything. And we can connect our UVs right up to our polar coordinates node. All right, the polar coordinates we just need to use the V coordinate, the one that goes around in a circle. So I'm going to drag this out and create a component mask node. And in this case, we just want the green. So let's go ahead and preview this. Here you can see we've got a gradient that goes from -0.5 around the circle to +0.5, and we actually want this to go from 0 to 1. So I'm going to create an add node here, and we're going to add 0.5. So now if we preview this one, you can see now we've got a 0 to 1 gradient going around our circle here. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is posterize this or break it up into individual segments. So I'm going to drag out here, and we'll add our posterize node. And this is going to break our really nice smooth gradient up into individual steps. So to control the steps, we need to add another function input. This is going to be a scalar, and we're going to call it steps. I'm going to give it a default value of 18. And we'll go ahead and connect that up to the steps of our posterize. And if we preview this, now you can see I've got a nice gradient going from 0 to 1 in 18 individual steps. Pretty cool. All right, we're making some good progress here. The next thing that we need to do is create a HistogramScan node that allows us to take our stepped gradient and step individually into each of these. So as we go along, each of these wedge shapes is going to become white. All right, I've already created the HistogramScan node. So let's go ahead and plop it in, and I'll show you how it works. And then I'll show you how we're going to make it, or how I made it. I'll plug our posterized gradient in here. And now we can control the position along this gradient. Let's go ahead and connect up our output result. And this contrast value here controls, well, actually here, I'll just right click here and start previewing this. And we're going to set our contrast to a value of 1 just so that it's perfectly sharp. All right, so now what you see is we've got an area of white and an area of black. What we had before here is a nice stepped gradient, but this allows us to pick a point along that gradient and set that point and everything above it to white. So we'll pick, start previewing here. And we need a new input now to control the position our position is defaulting to 0.5. Let me just add a value here. We'll just set it to 0 for now. And as let's see, can I slide this? No, I can't. I need to add an input value here. So we're going to add a new function input. I'll set it to a scalar. And we're going to set this to a value. We're going to name it position. And give it a default value of 0.5 and check the box down here. All right, now I can connect this position value up to position there. Actually, I want to name this progress. Okay, so now if I grab this value here, you can see that as we get this value lower and lower, you know, it's selecting individual wedges for us around the circle. And I don't have a nice slider like I did in Unity. In order to see this smoothly, I would have to jump out and create a material instance and then be able to do it that way. But here I can just kind of jump, you know, from segment to segment and we can see it working. I guess the other thing that I could do is we could bring in time and I could just ping pong time back and forth. So if I pick sine of time, let's see what that looks like. There we go. Yeah. Okay, so, all right, so I just added a multiply by 0.1 here for time. And now you can see we're doing a nice job using this HistogramScan node of moving along our gradient and jumping to those 18 individual steps here that we created with our posterize. One thing that you might notice is that we can never go all the way to the end of the gradient. So as we go around here, it never gets all the way to the end here. And in order to fix that, what I can do is take my input value here and just multiply it by, I'm going to multiply it by 1.004 just to give it a little extra at the end. And if we plug this in here now, what you're going to see is that it's going to go all the way to the end. So I'm going to get rid of my sine of time here, and we're going to plug in our progress instead. And this is going to allow us, let's see, we're going to set our progress to default of 0.5. Okay, so we've got our animated dial. And now for our final result, we just need to create a couple of masks that allow us to generate that shape of the little pit marks going around the circle. So the first thing that we need to do is create a mask for our outer circle. So we're going to add a circle node. And for the size of our circle, we're going to set this to 0.9 and plug it in. We're also going to plug in our UV coordinates to our circle here. And then instead of using the fill coming out of the circle, we're going to use the SDF output. And we're going to connect this to our anti-aliasing node. And then add a 1- to invert the result. And this is going to give us, well, I thought it was going to give us a circle. Looks like we need to set our cutoff here. I'm going to set the cutoff to 0. And yeah, now we've got our nice circle. And we can use this circle as a mask for the output of our histogram scan. So I'm going to add a multiply here. And we'll multiply that by our histogram scan and plug it in here at the end. Let's start previewing this. Now you can see we've got our nice circle. So this mask gives us our outside circle, but we also need our inside circle. So I'm going to clone or copy these nodes here, and we'll paste them down here at the bottom. And instead of a size of 0.9, I'm going to give this a size of 0.65. And this is going to give us a circle that is smaller. And notice here that we have our 1- node that inverts this, but we've not added a 1- here. And so this is going to give us the inverse of the circle. And we can also use that to multiply. So I'm going to multiply this one, and then we'll plug it in. And now you can see we've got a nice circle strip, or the outline of a circle. This is looking great. I just realized though that I told you guys I was gonna show you how I made this HistogramScan node, and I didn't. So before I forget again, let's jump into this HistogramScan node, and I'll show you how it's made. So what this node is doing is it takes a linear gradient. I'm just gonna add a saturate node here so that we can see a preview of this linear gradient output. So I've got a linear gradient that goes from 0 at the top to 1 down here at the bottom. And this HistogramScan node is working just like the one in Substance Designer, where it makes the whole gradient black below the selected midpoint and white above the selected midpoint. So let's take a look at what it's doing here. So here's my linear gradient. I've got an input for my material function for a gradient. I'm just defaulting it to use linear gradient. So my input gradient is a scalar, and I've checked the box down here. That's important. And then I add that to position. So the position is the value along the gradient, and I'm just defaulting it to the middle of the gradient, 0.5. I take that position value, multiply it by 2, and subtract 1. And that expands the position's range to -1 to 1. And then I add it to my gradient. And then up here I have my contrast control, and that controls how sharp the gradient is going to be. Right now I have my contrast control defaulted to 0.9. If I set this to 1, I'll get a gradient that's perfectly sharp, but by defaulting it to 0.9, I get a little bit of softness here. So the lower this value is, the softer my gradient is going to be. And depending on this position value, right now the cutoff mark is right in the middle of my gradient, but as I move my position down, it's going to come up here toward the top. And as I increase my position value, it's going to come down toward the bottom. All right, so you can see I took my contrast value and added a 1-, and then I subtracted position from this contrast value, and I also added this contrast value to position, and then I saturated both of those values, and then I added a smooth step and plugged my results into min and max of my smooth step. And I took the result of adding together my gradient with my position and plugged that into value. So what this allows me to do is scan through that gradient and pick the position where the gradient becomes white or black, and also to control the sharpness using this contrast node. So that's how my HistogramScan works. And if we switch back here to our progress style, you can see that I'm using that HistogramScan to go from my posterized node, which looks like this, to go to a more hard-coded value that looks like this. All right, the last thing that I need to do is incorporate my circle segments node, and that's going to serve to break up my continuous circle outline here into individual shapes. And so I'll just add the circle segments node. This is the one that we created last week. And we need to take this and change a couple of these parameters. So I'm going to set the spacing to a value of 0.1. Let's just preview this node for now so we can see what this is doing. And you can see by default we've got it animating here, but we actually want to stop that animation. So I'm just going to grab a value of 0 and plug that into our rotation. Okay, and so now we have a mask that we can use, and I can just multiply the result of our circle segments node by what we've got so far coming out. And if we plug this into our result, now you can see I've got my nice circle segments here broken up into individual parts. So this is going to be the alpha channel of our output. So I'm going to take my output result here, and we're just going to call this alpha. And now we just need to use this mask to incorporate some color into what we've done so far. So I'm going to come up here and create some constant vector 3s. I just hold down the 3 key and click to add that. And I'm going to set my first color here to kind of a yellow-orange. So I'll come over here to this portion of the color wheel, just kind of set it to a yellow-orange color. And then my second color, I'm going to set to a purple color. So I'm just going to come up here to this portion and then maybe make it a little bit darker purple. All right, so I've got my two colors, and now I just need to blend between these colors. With a linear interpolate, I'll blend between my yellow-orange and my purple. And I'm going to use the result of my posterize coming out of here. So if we preview this, you can see I've got my nice yellow color going around to purple. And because these colors are linear right now, I want to convert them to gamma space. And so I'm just going to do that simply by adding a power of 2.2. This is going to make my colors pop a little bit more. So if I preview this, now you can see I've got these colors that are really vibrant, going from a vibrant yellow around to a really vibrant purple. And I can just multiply the result coming out of here by this mask that I've got down here. And now if I preview this, you can see I've got my nice little pip marks going from my darker purple, and they'll go all the way around to yellow. So if I take my progress here and slide it along, you can see if I just give it a value of 1, I've got the full circle going from purple around to orange. Now I think I might want to make this purple just a little bit darker, so maybe I'll bring that down. Maybe just make it just a little bit more blue. And yeah, that'll give me a nice gradient going from purple around to yellow. Okay, I really like that result. So I'm going to take this output here, and instead of alpha 1, we're going to call this color. And I'm going to wire my color output into there. Okay, now I want this output to be first, so I'll set its priority to 0. I want this output to be second, so I'll set its priority to 1. And let's just slide our nodes over here a bit. And yeah, I think we're pretty much done. Let's just do a little bit of cleanup. I want my UVs to be first, and so I'll set those to 0. Then I'll set steps to be 1 and progress to be 2. And for my graph, let's see, I want to set this to expose to library, and I want to add it to procedural / examples. And there we are. We're all done. So I hope you enjoyed our tutorial today. We've got this really nice progress bar, and this is a material function, so you can throw it into any other graph that you'd like, and just use this progress input to control how far along the circle you are. And you can divide it up by the number of steps here. And if you wanted to make it more customizable, you could set these two color values to be exposed parameters as well, so that you can control which colors you're blending to as you go from the start to the end. All right, yeah, that's our tutorial for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Come back next week and we'll do some more cool procedural shapes and patterns. And until then, have a great week.